The fluorescent lights hummed like generators at forward-operating base shank, that same relentless electrical whine that had followed Katie Rodriguez from Helmand Province to the ICU at Oak Creek Memorial. She stood at the medication cart at 6:33 a.m., her hands moving with the kind of precision that took most nurses 5 years to develop. She had acquired it in exactly 4 months, under mortar fire, with no margin for error. Her badge read, Catherine Rodriguez, RN, registered 18 months ago. The dates were clean. The documentation was immaculate. Everything about her was designed to disappear into the hospital's machinery like water through a filter. The locker in the break room on the 3rd floor held her street clothes on the top shelf, neatly folded. Beneath them, wrapped in an old gym towel that hadn't seen a gymnasium in 7 years, sat a pair of worn combat boots. The leather was cracked from desert sun and something darker that no amount of cleaning could remove. The inside smelled like dust and sweat and the kind of metal tang that comes from being near things that explode. Faded into the right insole, in lettering that had been deliberately smudged to obscure it, was a single word, Reaper. Katie had not looked at those boots in 342 days. She did not intend to look at them today. She moved through the ICU corridors at 7:15 a.m. with a slight limp on her left side that worsened on days when the barometric pressure dropped. It had rained last night in Raleigh. Today the limp was barely perceptible unless someone was watching carefully. Dr. Hargrove was always watching carefully. He arrived at Oak Creek Memorial in a charcoal suit and Italian leather shoes that cost more than Katie's monthly rent, and he moved through the hospital corridors with the kind of confidence that comes from knowing your family had donated the obstetrics wing in 1987. His shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm that made the ICU nurses straighten their spines and check their charts twice. Katie was on the surgical floor during morning rounds when Dr. Hargrove arrived at the bedside of Marine Sergeant James Mitchell, who had come through the ICU doors 6 days earlier with an IED blast wound that had shredded his left side from ribs to hip. The sergeant was 24 years old and recovering faster than any patient Hargrove had documented in his career. He was also, unbeknownst to anyone but Hargrove's billing department, generating nearly $8,700 in daily hospital charges. That margin was supposed to be Hargrove's. Katie's meticulous charting had just made that margin significantly harder to justify. Status report, Hargrove said, not looking at Katie. He was addressing the medical student trailing behind him, a thin boy named Patterson who had learned to interpret Hargrove's tone as a series of unspoken commands. Katie continued documenting the sergeant's vitals on the bedside monitor, BP 118/76, O2 saturation 97%, heart rate 64. Normal. Boring. The kind of metrics that made it hard to justify another week of intensive care. Katie had learned in her first month at Oak Creek Memorial that precision was dangerous. Precision made people ask questions. Precision created paper trails. But precision was also the only way she knew how to function. She had spent for years moving through military hospitals and trauma units where a single decimal point in a dosage could mean the difference between stabilization and cascade failure. She had entered the civilian nursing system determined to be forgettable, but her hands refused to cooperate with that plan. She adjusted the foredrip on the sergeant's line, her movements economical and exact. Not rushing. Not hesitating. The kind of movement that suggested someone had done this particular procedure not 5 or 6 times, but 500 or 600 times. The needle went in without a second attempt. The gauge was perfect. The drip rate was calculated before she touched the dial. "How long have you been nursing?" Hargrove asked. He was still not looking directly at her. The question was casual, the kind of small talk that hospital administrators conducted while walking to the next patient. But something about his tone made the medical student shift his weight to his other foot. 18 months, Katie said. Her voice was soft. It was the voice of someone who understood that the quietest person in the room did not draw attention. "I came to North Carolina from a travel contract in California." "Your documentation is unusual," Hargrove continued. He pulled the sergeant's chart from the bedside pocket, and Katie watched as his eye scanned her entries. Every vital. Every medication. every time the patient moved or coughed or asked for water. Most nurses charted the minimum required for liability. Katie charted everything. Very detailed. "I prefer to be thorough, doctor." Sergeant Mitchell watched Katie's face as she spoke. He was a man who had learned to read people under conditions of extreme stress, whose survival had depended on understanding the micro-movements of human beings under pressure. He had spent 18 months with Marine combat camera crews documenting deployments to Anbar Province and the Helmand Valley. He knew what competence looked like when it appeared under a hospital gown and a badge from nursing school. The sergeant's initial trauma had been serious enough to require a chest tube insertion on admission. Katie had performed the procedure at 2:04 a.m., for minutes after he arrived in the ICU, when the attending surgeon was still 40 minutes out from the hospital. She had located the fifth intercostal space by feel alone, inserted the 36 French tube with a single smooth motion, and watched the pneumothorax collapse as air began to escape. The hiss of that air, the rapid drop in pressure, the immediate rise in oxygen saturation, these were the sounds of a procedure executed by someone who had performed it dozens of times before a live audience of monitors and alarms and other medical staff who were carefully not looking at each other. The chest tube insertion was professional, Hargrove said. He closed the chart. "For a nurse with your experience level." Katie had learned that compliments from Dr. Hargrove were actually questions wrapped in velvet. She did not respond. She simply nodded and continued her charting, her pen moving across the documentation with the same steady hand that had sutured abdominal wounds under blackout conditions in Baghdad. After Hargrove's rounds concluded and the attending team moved to the next patient, Sergeant Mitchell reached for the call button. Katie was beside his bed in 7 seconds, because that was the response time she had trained into her nervous system. 7 seconds was protocol. 7 seconds was professional. 7 seconds did not suggest anything unusual about a nurse's reaction time. "I've worked with combat medics," the sergeant said. His voice was quiet. It carried the kind of certainty that comes from having observed something your training taught you to recognize. "In the field. In Helmand, mostly. Sanjan Valley. 3 deployments. I watched them work." Katie did not move. She kept her hand on the fall line. "What you did when I came in," Mitchell continued. "That chest tube. That wasn't nursing school technique. That was operator-level work. That was the kind of thing you learn in a place where they shoot at you while you're trying to keep someone alive." Katie looked at him. She did not flinch. She did not blink. She simply held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned back to the fall line. "You should rest, Sergeant. Your body is healing." But something had shifted in the room. Sergeant Mitchell had recognized something. The question was whether he would ask for confirmation or maintain operational security on a secret that was not his to share. In his office on the 7th floor, Dr. Hargrove was sitting behind his desk, reviewing the past 4 weeks of billing records. Katie's charts documented every procedure, every medication, every change in patient status. Most of her documentation would be ignored by the insurance companies. Some of it, the specific notations about unnecessary CT scans, the questioning observations about drug interactions that seemed contradictory, was creating a paper trail that an auditor could follow. He had been managing this billing strategy for 8 years. Inflated charges for intensive care procedures that bordered on unnecessary. Prescriptions for medications that ran up costs without improving outcomes. Diagnostic imaging that looked impressive on charts but often yielded nothing. The margins had been significant enough to fund a beach house in Wilmington, a membership at the Raleigh Country Club, and a 2019 Mercedes-AMG that was parked in the physician lot with its own dedicated spot. Katie's meticulous documentation had already exposed 3 coding inconsistencies this month. 3. Hargrove opened the file for Sergeant Mitchell's case and began calculating what the next 6 weeks of intensive care documentation could generate. $7,800 a day. $54,000 a week. $216,000 over the course of a month. Unless something changed. Unless someone questioned the necessity of keeping a patient in critical care when his vital signs suggested he was stable enough for a regular medical floor. Katie's charting made questioning the necessity impossible. He began making notes on his desk pad. Not notes about medical treatment. Notes about staffing, scheduling, and the precise way someone who appeared to be a competent but unremarkable new nurse had somehow managed to develop skills that suggested an entire background that contradicted her employment file. When Katie finished her shift at 7:13 p.m. that evening, she stopped at her locker. She did not open it. She simply stood in front of it, her hand resting on the cool metal, listening to the break room sounds around her. The refrigerator hummed. Water ran in the sink where someone was rinsing out a coffee cup. Outside, the Raleigh evening was settling into darkness at the edge of autumn. She had made it 542 days. She had become a person. She had developed references and a social security number and a nursing license that was absolutely legitimate. She had become Catherine Rodriguez, trauma-aware specialist, who had somehow managed to keep her hand steady enough to heal people while her mind maintained the exact distance required to remain invisible. The medical staff at Oak Creek Memorial knew her as a quiet nurse with excellent documentation and steady hands. They did not know her as Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, who had spent for years with the 2nd Marine Division, 3 deployments to Helmand Province, and 1 classified operation in Baghdad that had ended with her entire team killed while extracting a CIA asset from a compound that officially did not exist. They did not know about the Navy Cross. They did not know about the 23 pages of after-action report that had been redacted so thoroughly that even she could not read what had actually happened that night. But something had changed. The sergeant had seen something. And Dr. Hargrove was starting to ask the kind of questions that did not have comfortable answers. Rounds began at 7 in the morning. Dr. Hargrove entered the sergeant's room with his entourage, 2 residents, a medical student, and Katie following 3 steps behind, her tablet holding the medication charts and vital sign log she'd updated at 6:30 before anyone else arrived. The sergeant's wife sat in the corner chair. His mother stood by the window. Their eyes followed Hargrove like he was already writing the diagnosis on their hearts. Sergeant Mitchell is responding well to conservative management, Hargrove announced, his voice the kind that fills rooms without raising. The IED blast missed his vital organs by centimeters. Remarkable luck. He didn't look at Mitchell. He looked at the family. We're maintaining him on a morphine drip at current dosing, antibiotics covering gram-positive and negative organisms, and he'll be cleared for physical therapy within 72 hours. Katie's jaw tightened. She'd reviewed the chart at 6 in the morning. The morphine order from midnight shift was for milligrams every 2 hours. For a man with Mitchell's weight, blast-induced pneumonia risk factors, and the respiratory depression already showing in his overnight vitals, that dosage was approaching toxic threshold. She'd flagged it. She'd documented the concern in her notes. Protocol demanded she escalate before the next dose. Hargrove turned toward the door. Katie stepped forward. "Doctor, the morphine dosing." "Yes?" He stopped mid-stride, turned fully to face her. His voice dropped half an octave. "More dangerous that way. The 4 milligrams Q2-hour protocol. Given the sergeant's respiratory status and his blast-related lung injury, the standard dosing for trauma cases is typically. Hargrove's eyebrow arched. The medical student's pen stopped moving. "Miss Rodriguez, perhaps you'd like to explain to the sergeant's family here why you feel qualified to countermand my medication orders." The wife's hand went to her mouth. Katie's breathing stayed level. "The dosage you ordered last night would cause respiratory depression. His oxygen saturation is already at 91%. Another 4 milligrams at the next cycle. Are you questioning my judgment?" Hargrove stepped closer. His presence filled the space like a pressure system moving in. "You've been employed at Oak Creek Memorial for 6 months. I have been practicing medicine for 20 years. The family doesn't need to hear nursing school theory masquerading as clinical expertise." He gestured toward the sergeant's mother. "Let me be clear, when nurses begin to believe they understand pharmacology better than their physicians, that's when mistakes happen. Serious mistakes." The room held its breath. The ventilator beside the sergeant's bed wheezed its mechanical rhythm, indifferent to the hierarchy being established. Katie took one measured breath. Her eyes met Hargrove's. A single tear escaped her left eye, not from fear, but from the precision required to contain what was actually underneath. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her hand steady as a surgeon's, and spoke in a voice so quiet the medical student had to lean forward to hear. I've held more lives together with field sutures than you've seen in your career. The silence was absolute. Hargrove's face flushed crimson, not the red of embarrassment, but the arterial red of a man whose authority had just been questioned in front of an audience he needed to impress. His hands clenched. Get out. Now. Katie turned and left. She didn't hurry. She didn't apologize. She simply walked out of the room with the bearing of someone who'd already survived far worse than a surgeon's wounded pride, leaving behind a wake of confusion and a family wondering what they'd just witnessed. By afternoon, the consequences had crystallized. Katie arrived at her locker to find a printout taped to the metal door. Her name in bold at the top of the hospital's public disciplinary board, the large cork notice posted in the break room where every shift could see it. Rodriguez, Katie M., incident date 7/45, insubordination, questioning physician orders in front of patients and families. Formal written warning. One additional incident will result in immediate termination pending review. The entire fourth floor could see it. Patients' families could see it. Every nurse, every tech, every orderly walking past the break room would see her name and would know she was the kind of employee who didn't respect the chain of command. That same afternoon, Katie sat in the break room at 4 o'clock during her break. She'd been part of the coffee rotation for 3 months. Sarah from pediatrics had invited her to lunch twice. Marcus from the ER had shown her how to optimize the charting software. They'd laughed together about a patient who'd insisted his doctor looked like a crime television actor. Now, when Katie sat down at the table with her cold sandwich and water, Sarah gathered her Tupperware without a word. Marcus suddenly remembered a patient he needed to check on. Another nurse Katie had never spoken to before smiled politely and excused herself. Within 90 seconds, the table was empty. The coffee pot sat cooling on the warmer. Katie was alone with the fluorescent hum and the sensation of watching a door close quietly but completely. She understood. Hargrove had currency, overtime shifts, favorable schedules, recommendations that could boost careers or slow them. Katie was a liability. A new nurse who somehow knew things she shouldn't know. A person who'd corrected a senior physician in front of his audience. That kind of risk wasn't worth friendship. By evening, Hargrove was working. Katie saw him in the hallway near the medication dispensary, and his face arranged itself into something approximating a smile. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. 3 patients' families were visible in nearby rooms. Careful, sweetheart. One more write-up and you're gone. He leaned against the counter with the casual confidence of someone holding all the advantages. Maybe try something more suitable. Cosmetics sales. Retail. Something where you won't be tempted to play doctor. Katie's hands trembled as she removed the disciplinary notice from the break room bulletin board. Per protocol, she was entitled to take the copy, but her face remained composed. Smooth. A mask so complete that Hargrove couldn't find the seam. What he didn't see was the calculation behind her eyes. What he couldn't perceive was that her trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint. The restraint of someone who'd held a perimeter alone in Baghdad for 40 minutes after her entire team was killed. The restraint of someone whose actual rank and qualifications existed in classified databases he would never access. The restraint of someone who understood that showing weakness now would be the only victory Hargrove could claim. She folded the notice, placed it in her pocket, and continued her shift, checking vital signs and adjusting drips and documenting everything with the meticulous precision that had already begun to concern a surgeon who'd gotten very comfortable with his own infallibility. But that wasn't the worst part. At 2 in the morning, during the graveyard shift when the hospital dimmed and the ICU became a cave of monitors and whispered conversations, the sergeant's heart monitor began to drift. His oxygen saturation dropped from 91 to 88. His neck veins distended like cables pulled taut. Katie was at his bedside within seconds because she'd been checking on him every hour, not because protocol demanded it, but because something in the way he'd looked at her during rounds had told her that Hargrove's medication order was a countdown. Cardiac tamponade, she whispered, reading his body like text written in blood and physics. Fluid accumulating around his heart. Pressure building. His heart was beginning to collapse. The code team was for minutes out. Hargrove was asleep 20 minutes away, phone silenced. Katie stood at the equipment cart and began preparing the pericardiocentesis kit with hands that had performed the procedure exactly twice, both times in a convoy outside Fallujah with incoming fire and no luxury of a sterile field and a surgeon standing by to supervise. She positioned the needle below his xiphoid process at 45 degrees. The sergeant's eyes opened, clouded but aware. "You're not just a nurse," he whispered through lips turning blue. "I've seen combat medics work. That's operator-level technique." Katie didn't answer. She advanced the needle. Felt the give of the pericardial sac. Aspirated. Blood flowed dark and immediate into the syringe, 200 milliliters of pressure released, his heart given room to beat again. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. The rhythm steadied. Color returned to his face like a switch being thrown. The code team arrived to find the crisis resolved, Katie calmly disposing of the needle into the sharps container, her charting already begun. Hargrove arrived 30 minutes later. He reviewed the chart. He reviewed the procedure note. He reviewed the sergeant's vitals trending upward. And Katie watched his face shift through several calculations, not relief that a patient had been saved, but something colder. Concern. Recognition. The beginning of understanding that he'd made a critical error in judgment about who he was standing next to. A new nurse with 6 months of experience shouldn't have those skills. A new nurse shouldn't move with that precision. A new nurse shouldn't know emergency procedures well enough to execute them flawlessly in a crisis. She was becoming a liability he couldn't control. By dawn, he'd made his calls. 6 of them, made from his office before the morning rounds, made with the confidence of someone who'd spent 20 years building a network that responded when he needed leverage. To the hospital board chair, "We have a credentialing concern." To Katie's nursing school references, "I'm concerned about her clinical judgment in high-stress situations." To the state licensing board, "I want to file a formal inquiry." To the hospital attorney, liability exposure from a staff member practicing beyond scope. To board members he'd golfed with for years, "Something you should know about Rodriguez." To an outside auditing firm, "I need every chart she's touched examined for discrepancies." He wasn't fighting alone. He was activating every connection he'd cultivated, every favor he'd built up, every institutional lever he could pull. Katie Rodriguez was a threat to his insurance fraud scheme because her charting was meticulous. Her observations were accurate. Her documentation of his medication errors was clinical and irrefutable. He needed her gone before she became undeniable. Katie arrived for her next shift to find a hospital investigator waiting at her locker, and 3 administrators in the break room requesting her presence immediately. The monitor's rhythm stuttered at 2:07 a.m. 1 beat. 2 beats. Then flat line. Katie was 6 floors away, restocking the medication cart on the 3rd floor surgical wing, when her phone vibrated. She didn't look at it. She was moving before the text from the ICU nurse finished loading. Muscle memory from 17 years of field work. The phone was already in her pocket. Her feet were already running. The sergeant's room erupted in fluorescent chaos as she hit the ICU doors. The monitor screamed its single monotone wail. The night nurse, a tech student named Marcus, stood frozen beside the bed, hands hovering like he was afraid to touch anything. The full line swayed with the sergeant's stillness. His skin had gone the color of old pennies. "Get the crash cart," Katie said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Marcus moved. She didn't check the monitor again. She knew what she was looking at. The X-ray from this morning was still in her head, a shadow on the right side of the chest cavity that Hargrove had dismissed as post-procedural fluid. Not a shadow. Blood. Cardiac tamponade. The pericardial sac filling with blood until the sergeant's heart had nowhere to beat. She was already gloved and prepping the insertion site. Right anterior chest, fourth intercostal space, just lateral to the sternum. Her hands moved on their own, finding the landmark she'd learned under mortar fire in a forward surgical team, the one she could do with her eyes closed and her ears ringing from explosions. The kit was waiting, a 14-gauge angiocath needle, a syringe, tubing. Someone had opened the pericardiocentesis tray. Someone had been paying attention. The needle went in smooth. No hesitation. No trembling. Her hands were steady as surgical steel. Slow, she whispered, more to herself than anyone else. The blood came back dark and thick. 200 cc of it, then 250. The pressure inside that sac dropping with every milliliter she withdrew. The needle hummed against her fingertips as the pressure equalized. The monitor changed. A single beat. Then another. "We've got sinus rhythm," Marcus breathed. The code team thundered through the doors at 2:14 a.m. 7 minutes since flatline. 7 minutes since her heart had stopped and she'd held it in her hands and decided it wasn't finished yet. The attending physician, Dr. Cade, who'd trained at Walter Reed and recognized the procedure the moment he saw the needle placement, didn't say anything. He just nodded and took over, checking vitals, ordering labs, moving with the precision of someone who understood exactly what had just happened in this room. Katie stepped back. Stripped off her gloves. The sergeant's oxygen saturation was climbing. 91. 94. 102. The blood pressure stabilizing around 98 systolic. The monitor's rhythm was poetry, regular, strong, uninterrupted. Normal sinus rhythm. Life, reassembled by hands that had been trained to reassemble it. She was in the hallway when Dr. Hargrove found her. He was in scrubs despite the hour, his face flushed the color of a medical error. Behind him walked the hospital's legal counsel and the compliance officer, both in business casual despite the pre-dawn darkness, both carrying the look of men summoned from their beds for something catastrophic. "Miss Rodriguez." "My office." "Now." She didn't follow. She stood in the ICU hallway, listening to the sergeant's monitor beeping in the room behind her. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electric hymn. Somewhere down the corridor, a ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. "That's not a request," Hargrove said. His voice had that edge, the one he used when he was losing control and trying to sound authoritative instead. Trying to sound certain. The compliance officer cleared his throat. "We'll need your badge and credentials pending investigation." Katie turned toward them. She didn't speak. She unclipped her hospital badge and set it on the nearest monitor. It landed face down. The photo nobody ever looked at anyway. 20 minutes later, she was sitting across from Hargrove in his office while the legal counsel read prepared language about unauthorized procedures, lack of credentialing, falsification of employment records, and suspension pending full investigation. The words floated past like debris. The sergeant was alive. That was the only fact that mattered. "Where did you learn pericardiocentesis?" Hargrove's voice was thin. "High. Stretched across fear like tissue paper. Your resume shows RN program, community college, graduated 8 months ago. You don't have advanced training certifications. You don't have surgical rotation. You performed a bilateral blind needle insertion on a moving target under pressure and drew a perfect 200 cc without perforation." Katie's jaw tightened. One breath. Just one measured breath and her face stayed smooth as still water. "Your licensing file shows no military service. No field medicine training. No prior employment history before this hospital." He leaned forward. The legal counsel shifted, uncomfortable, because Hargrove was supposed to stick to the prepared statement and he was improvising now, chasing something. "Or should I ask who you really are?" She couldn't answer. If she answered, she'd confirm what he suspected. If she confirmed it, she'd shatter the orders that buried her identity, the classified operation that took her entire team, the command directive that said if her real rank ever surfaced, if her real history ever emerged, there would be questions about Baghdad that the Pentagon had decided would never be answered. She had been ordered to disappear. "I have nothing to say," Katie said. She stood. The legal counsel shuffled papers. Hargrove's face darkened with something that looked like triumph. He'd won, she was leaving, the problem was being removed, but his hands were shaking. He'd won by suspicion, not certainty. And he knew it. She turned in her access card to security. Left her scrubs in her locker next to those worn combat boots. Drove away from Oak Creek Memorial as the sun was rising, painting the Raleigh skyline in shades of copper and blood orange. The VA hospital was 40 minutes away. She sat in the waiting room at 9:48 a.m., surrounded by veterans in various states of recovery. A Marine with a prosthetic left leg scrolled through his phone. An Army veteran with tremors in both hands filled out forms with his daughter guiding his hand. An older woman in a Navy cap waited for her appointment, staring out the window at nothing. Katie held the worn combat boots in her lap, the only documentation of her service that had never been filed in a system. Never been logged. Never been officially acknowledged. The intake nurse, a woman named Diane with kind eyes and a name tag that read 15 years of service, didn't recognize her. Nobody ever did. "What brings you in today?" Diane asked, her pen poised over the intake form. Katie had to think about it. The reason. The actual clinical reason for sitting here. The panic attacks that started in Kandahar province and never left. The way certain sounds made her muscles lock up. The night she woke up convinced she was still in that compound in Baghdad, bleeding out on the floor. The way she'd learned to function by compartmentalizing every fear into a box labeled "not now" and never, ever opening it. Panic attacks, Katie said. Since deployment. The pen wrote it down. 7 years of untreated panic disorder. 7 years of working ICU shifts with a racing heart and steady hands, saving other people's lives while her own nervous system screamed in corners she never let anyone see. "We'll get you scheduled with Dr. Martinez. She's excellent." Diane smiled. Professional. Warm. The way people smile at strangers. "When was your last duty station?" Katie was quiet for a long moment. She looked at the worn combat boots in her lap, scuffed leather, frayed laces, faded insignia barely visible on the tongue. The only proof. The only evidence. The only thing that said she hadn't imagined the last 17 years. "Baghdad," she said finally. "Forward surgical team attached to 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse Company." Diane's eyes shifted. She understood what those unit designations meant. She'd probably worked with Marines who came back from that rotation. Probably known some who didn't come back at all. "Thank you for your service," Diane said. She meant it. Katie nodded. The boots were heavy in her lap. Anchors. Proof. A secret. She wondered if disappearing completely might be easier than this, being half visible, half present, a ghost in scrubs moving through the lives of people who would never know what she'd done, who would never understand that she'd held surgical instruments under fire and sewn together young men whose names she was never allowed to remember. That she'd been someone once. Someone with rank and authority and a team that trusted her with their lives. Now she was just a suspended nurse holding onto a pair of old boots in a VA hospital waiting room, waiting for someone to tell her it was normal to be terrified of the fluorescent lights, the monitor beeps, the smell of antiseptic that smelled like the medical tent where she'd lost half her team to an IED that detonated while she was stabilizing someone else. Normal. That word meant nothing. The phone in her pocket stayed silent. No texts. No calls. Just the sound of the waiting room, the hum of institutional fluorescent lights, the rustle of magazines being turned, the soft breathing of veterans who'd all seen something the world wasn't meant to see and lived with it anyway. Katie held those worn combat boots and waited for her intake appointment, terrified and unnamed and utterly, completely alone. The intake form asked for her psychiatric history. Katie stared at the blank spaces, 17 years of deployments, Baghdad, the extraction that killed her entire team, the panic attacks that came without warning or mercy, the night she couldn't breathe without counting in her head. She couldn't write any of it. The VA hospital in Raleigh was supposed to be a refuge, but it felt like a zoo of mirrors, each face in the waiting room someone she'd treated in a field hospital 8,000 miles away, dust in their hair, fours in their arms, terror in their eyes. Now they didn't recognize her? Now she was just another woman in civilian clothes clutching a clipboard. One of them sat 3 chairs down. Corporal Williams. She'd sutured his hand in Sanjin Valley when an IED blast sent shrapnel through his palm. She'd counted his fingers, all 5 still there, and he'd wept with relief. Now he was reading a 3-month-old copy of Sports Illustrated, and Katie kept her face angled toward the floor. He couldn't know her. Nobody could know her. That was the whole architecture of the life the Pentagon had built around her: disappear, become someone else, live in the hollow space between 2 identities until you forget which one was real. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like wasps trapped in plastic. Katie's leg bounced, a tell, a weakness, exactly what the therapist she'd never been allowed to see had probably called hyperarousal. She forced it still. Control was everything now. Composure was ammunition. The panic attacks had started 3 weeks after Baghdad, when she'd woken up in a hotel room in Northern Virginia with her hand shaking so badly she couldn't hold a coffee cup. By the time she'd enrolled in nursing school, the attacks had learned to hide. They came at 3 a.m. They came when she was alone. They came when someone called her just a nurse, and for 1/2 second, she believed it. She looked down at the combat boots in her lap. They were the only piece of her real self she still owned. Every official record of Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Marie Rodriguez had been locked behind classified filing systems. Her medals were in a safe deposit box she couldn't claim. Her discharge papers were sealed. The Pentagon had buried her the way they buried drone strikes and black site interrogations. She died in Baghdad and came back as someone's daughter, someone's sister, someone's fresh nursing school graduate, anyone but the person she actually was. The boots were falling apart. The leather was cracked where shrapnel from a mortar round had caught her during a patrol in 2019. The laces had been replaced 4 times. The soles were worn thin from running through compound walls while her team lay dead behind her. These boots had been everywhere she'd been. They were the only artifact that proved she wasn't insane, that she hadn't imagined the last 12 years. Rodriguez, Katie. A woman with a clipboard appeared in the doorway. Katie stood, tucking the boots under her arm like they might disappear, like the VA might confiscate them the way the Pentagon had confiscated everything else. She followed the intake nurse down a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and institutional despair. The nurse asked questions Katie couldn't answer truthfully. How long have you been experiencing panic attacks? Classified. Have you experienced combat-related trauma? Classified. Are you currently employed? Suspended. Do you have a support system? Negative. The appointment lasted 20 minutes. The psychiatrist, a man named Dr. Winters with kind eyes and the posture of someone who'd seen too many veterans end their stories in parking lots, recommended a benzodiazepine prescription and weekly therapy. Katie took the prescription slip but knew she wouldn't fill it. Medications created records. Records could be traced. Traces could expose her. She'd learned to live with the panic attacks the way soldiers learn to live with hearing loss and tinnitus, as background noise in a life that had been permanently broken the moment command said disappear. She drove back to her apartment as dusk turned the sky the color of old bruises. The city looked different now than it had 4 days ago, when she was still Katie the nurse, when Dr. Hargrove was still just a man stealing money from insurance companies. Now everything felt like a countdown. How long before someone figured out that a 6-month nursing student shouldn't know how to perform a pericardiocentesis? How long before the questions became official? How long before the Pentagon decided she was a liability and erased her completely? Her apartment was sparse: a mattress, a chair, a small table. She sat on the edge of the bed and held the boots. For the first time since the suspension, since Hargrove's voice had cut through the ICU like a knife, she let herself think about leaving completely. Not just disappearing into another city. Disappearing into nothing. The Pentagon had given her a new name once. They could do it again. She could become someone else, someone without a past, someone without scars, someone without memories of holding a perimeter while 17 enemy combatants tried to kill her. The phone rang at 9:14 p.m. Unknown number. Katie almost didn't answer. Ms. Rodriguez. A woman's voice, urgent. This is Rebecca Mitchell. You worked with my husband, Sergeant Marcus Mitchell. He's asking for you. He keeps saying your name. Please come back to the hospital. Katie's hand went still. The sergeant. In all the chaos of the suspension, Hargrove's savagery, the drive to the VA, she'd let herself forget that he was still there, still recovering, still fighting his own battle. I'm not authorized. I don't care. Please. The phone disconnected. Katie was in her car 5 minutes later, the combat boots on the passenger seat like a witness, like a jury made of leather and memory. Oak Creek Memorial's parking lot was dark when she pulled in at 8:36 p.m. She parked near the visitor entrance and walked through corridors that should have felt familiar but now felt like enemy territory. Her badge was in a drawer at home, confiscated in all but name. She climbed the stairs to the 4th floor, avoiding the elevators where she might encounter staff who knew her, and approached the ICU through the back entrance, moving the way she'd moved through Baghdad compounds, aware of every exit, every camera, every potential threat. Sergeant Mitchell's room was the second bed from the window. He was awake, more color in his face than when she'd left him on the floor of the ICU. His eyes found her immediately, and they widened. Rodriguez. Hey, Sergeant. Katie kept her voice level, kept her body loose. You gave Rebecca quite the assignment. Couldn't stop thinking about it. About what you did. He was sitting up, the cardiac monitors showing a steady rhythm. The way you moved. The way you knew. That wasn't nursing school, was it? Katie pulled a chair close but didn't sit. She wasn't staying. She couldn't stay. Doesn't matter now. It does. His voice dropped. I know what I saw. I know what my body felt. You moved like someone who'd done it before. Who'd done it in? The ICU doors exploded open. A man in civilian clothes, dark jeans, grey hoodie, face obscured, moved toward the sergeant's room with the posture of someone who knew exactly where he was going. He had his right hand jammed in his pocket. Katie saw the shape of it before anything else, the outline of a pistol, unmistakable to anyone who'd been trained to see it. She moved. Not toward the door. Not toward the call button. Toward the space between the man and the sergeant. Her body went into the gap like a lock sliding into place. You need to leave, she said. Her voice was flat. It was the voice of someone who'd given the same order to 17 people in Baghdad, and they'd listened because they recognized authority when they heard it. The man raised the weapon. Katie's shoulder exploded first. The gun sounded like thunder in the small room. The bullet went through soft tissue, separated muscle fiber, left a hole that the human body didn't come back from. She felt it as data, entry wound, left anterior shoulder, approximately 9 millimeters, significant hemorrhage imminent. She didn't move. The second shot came before she could process the first. Her ribs. Below the heart. Exactly where her body armor would have been if she were still the person she used to be. The third shot followed 2 seconds later, abdominal, deep, hitting muscle and potentially organ. She dropped to one knee, and the sergeant was screaming, and her hands moved automatically to the bedframe to keep her body between his and the man with the gun. The fourth shot hit her left thigh. The fifth hit her right calf. Security arrived 18 seconds after the fourth shot. 2 officers tackled the man and wrenched the gun away. Katie was on the floor, bleeding from 5 different wounds, her vision starting to narrow at the edges like a camera lens stopping down. The pain was information. Pain was data. Pain meant she was still conscious, still protecting the perimeter, still the senior chief petty officer who didn't surrender. Sergeant Mitchell fell out of his bed and onto the floor beside her, his monitor's alarm screaming. He gripped her hand with tears running down his face. "Stay with me," he said. "Stay with me." She couldn't answer. Her mouth was filling with the taste of copper. Her breathing was becoming shallow, controlled, the way she'd been trained to breathe when her body was trying to die. The sergeant leaned close to her ear. His voice was a whisper. "Reaper." That was the moment Katie knew everything was about to change. The moment she knew that her carefully constructed civilian identity, the suspension, the desperation, the exile into invisibility, all of it was about to be torn away. Because only the Marines who'd served with her knew that call sign. Only the Marines from 2nd Force Recon knew that name. And the fact that this man knew it meant he'd known all along. Meant the Pentagon knew. Meant the moment she'd shown him those skills in the ICU, someone had already made a phone call to a number that didn't officially exist. As the code team rushed in, as she felt her consciousness starting to tunnel, as Hargrove's voice cut through the chaos ordering everyone to move her, to deny her, to treat her as a legal liability, Katie understood that you couldn't disappear twice. You couldn't erase yourself and expect to stay erased. The moment you saved someone's life, the moment you used the skills that made you who you actually were, you called yourself back into existence whether you wanted to be found or not. The sergeant's words echoed as the world went dark, "Reaper." And somewhere in the Pentagon, in a classified office where people didn't officially work on problems that didn't officially exist, someone was already making calls. The sergeant's hand tightened around hers, and a single word escaped his lips like a prayer, "Reaper." Her call sign. The one thing she'd buried deeper than any classified file, deeper than the graves of her team in Arlington. Her eyes met his across the fluorescent haze of the ICU, a moment of recognition that meant everything was about to change. Somewhere in the distance, a helicopter was already spinning up. 48 hours. That's how long it took for Katie Rodriguez to stop being invisible. The doors burst open at 0600 hours with the sound of boots hitting tile in perfect synchronization. Not the shuffle of hospital staff. Not the organized chaos of a code team. This was military formation, 200 Marines in dress blues, marching down the corridor with the kind of precision that made nurses freeze mid-stride and doctors step aside without a word. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead like they sensed what was coming. The air pressure changed. You could feel the weight of it, institutional authority made flesh, made bone, made the kind of presence that doesn't ask permission to occupy space. A lieutenant colonel stepped forward, his dress uniform decorated with ribbons that climbed his chest like a mountain range of service. His jaw could cut glass. His eyes locked on Katie where she lay in the hospital bed, bandaged across her shoulder, ribs, abdomen, both legs wrapped in gauze that would take weeks to fully come down. 5 gunshot wounds. 5 moments where she'd thrown herself between an armed intruder and Sergeant Mitchell without hesitation, without calculating odds, without doing anything except what operators do, protect the mission, protect the team. Senior Chief Petty Officer Katie Rodriguez, the lieutenant colonel said, and his voice moved through the room like a tank idling in a garage, low, controlled, absolute. Combat service record, 12 years, 3 tours, Operation Iraqi Freedom. He pulled a folder from his aide. News cameras were already rolling. This wasn't an internal recognition. This was public reclamation. Bronze Star for Leadership Under Fire, Camp Fallujah, 2008. A nurse in the corner gasped audibly. Sarah from Pediatrics, one of the ones who'd abandoned Katie in the break room when Hargrove promised overtime. The cameras swung toward her. Silver Star for Direct Action Against Hostile Forces, Sanjin Valley, Helmand Province, 2010. The lieutenant colonel's voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Each medal became its own sentence, its own impact. The hospital board members who'd gathered in the doorway, the same ones Hargrove had called at dawn, the same ones who'd approved Katie's suspension without question, began exchanging glances like they were starting to understand they'd been positioned on the wrong side of something. 2 Purple Hearts. And a Navy Cross for the Baghdad compound extraction where your entire team was killed and you held a defensive perimeter alone for 41 minutes while command organized the recovery. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence that has weight. That takes up space. Doctors who'd ignored Katie in the hallway, who'd whispered that she was lucky to keep her job, suddenly looked at their shoes. Then a Marine general stepped forward, his uniform so decorated it caught the camera flashes like a mirror. His presence made the air pressure change again. He turned directly toward Dr. Hargrove, who'd been standing at the back of the ICU with his arms crossed, his face cycling through colors, first red, then purple, then the waxy white of someone understanding that his world had just collapsed in real time. Dr. Hargrove, the general said quietly. Senior Chief Rodriguez was ordered into deep cover for national security purposes. You didn't know that. You couldn't have known that. What you did know was that she saved a Marine's life with a procedure that should have been impossible for someone with her documented training level. And instead of asking questions, instead of recognizing excellence, you suspended the most decorated combat medic in Marine Corps history because she threatened your financial interests. Hargrove's jaw moved. Nothing came out. Behind him, hospital security had already positioned themselves at the ICU door. Our JAG investigation, the general continued, turning to address the hospital board directly, began when Senior Chief Rodriguez's meticulous charting flagged irregularities in billing practices. Dr. Hargrove has been running an insurance fraud scheme involving inflated billing for unnecessary procedures for 14 months. Her documentation provided the evidence trail. He handed a folder to the hospital CEO. $2.3 million in fraudulent claims. Every one of them documented by the woman he called a sweetheart. Every one of them caught by the nurse he told to try cosmetic sales. The CEO's face went purple. An actual medical crisis, Katie thought with the dark humor that comes from having survived actual combat. Dude's about to stroke out. It wasn't a request. The general's voice dropped lower. This hospital terminated Dr. Hargrove's employment effective immediately. His medical license is under emergency review by the state board as of 0400 hours this morning. And before any of you ask, yes, that happened while you were sleeping. Yes, the FBI already has copies of everything. Hargrove backed toward the wall like prey, recognizing the apex predator in the room. This is absurd, he said, his voice cracking on the second word. She's been here 6 months. She couldn't possibly have documented anything that. She documented every discrepancy. The general cut him off with the precision of a surgical blade. Every inflated charge. Every unnecessary procedure. Every falsified diagnosis code. Because that's what Marines do. We pay attention to details. We keep records. We build cases. He paused. 1 beat. 2. You tried to fire her to cover your crimes. You suspended her for saving a life. You activated every institutional advantage you possessed against a decorated service member, and you did it because her competence was going to cost you money. The board chair stood up. Dr. Hargrove, security will escort you from the building. Hargrove's voice rose, not with authority, but with desperation. You can't do this. I have contracts. I have patients. You have a lawyer, the general said. Call him. He nodded to security. 2 hospital officers approached Hargrove like they were escorting someone dangerous. Not with aggression. With professional courtesy. With the kind of respect you give someone who's about to lose everything. Cameras followed. News crews clustered in the hallway. Hargrove was walked out past 200 Marines standing at attention, their dress uniforms immaculate, their faces forward, their presence a statement louder than any words. He passed Sarah from pediatrics, who ripped his public disciplinary notice off the board and tore it into pieces. He passed Marcus from the ER, who snapped to attention and saluted, a gesture that meant nothing officially because Marcus had never served, but everything because Marcus understood what was happening. He was watching institutional loyalty evaporate in real time. He was watching the cost of standing on the wrong side of honor. By evening, the story was national news. By morning, Hargrove's medical license was under emergency review. By Friday, it was permanently revoked. The network he'd activated against Katie, board members, investigators, attorneys, all distanced themselves instantly. His calls went unreturned. His emails bounced. He was radioactive. Untouchable. A cautionary tale about what happens when you weaponize institutional power against someone with nothing left to lose. 6 months later, Katie walked past a strip mall on the corner of Wade Avenue and Fayetteville Street in Raleigh, stopped at a traffic light. She was in service dress blues, the formal uniform, the one with ribbons and insignia that told the story of her actual life. On her way to the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the new Raleigh Military Medical Center where she served as Director of Combat Medicine Training. Where she taught young nurses and medics how to recognize the difference between protocol and common sense. How to fight for their patients even when the institution fought back. Through the strip mall window, between a nail salon and a check-cashing store, she saw him. Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table under a banner reading Supplemental Insurance, All Carriers. His suit was rumpled. His eyes were hollow. He saw her and looked away. The traffic light turned green. Katie kept walking. The worn combat boots sat in a glass case in her office now, alongside her citations. She didn't hide anymore. The sergeant, fully recovered, his cardiac function restored to normal, worked down the hall in Veterans Affairs Outreach. Sarah from Pediatrics had transferred to the military hospital to work under Katie's leadership. Marcus from the ER wrote her a letter of apology that sat framed in her desk drawer. At the ceremony, 200 veterans attended, many of them people she'd treated in Baghdad field hospitals who finally recognized her face now that she could show it without fear. A young Marine corporal approached nervously as the ceremony concluded. "Senior Chief? I heard you were Reaper. My brother served with you in 2019. He didn't make it home. But he wrote about you. Said you were the one who..." Katie gripped his hand. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the authority of someone who'd made decisions under fire, who'd held lives together with field sutures and field experience and the kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst. "I remember him. I remember all of them. Every single one. Their names are in my notebook. The one I keep next to those boots." That evening, Katie stood before a crowd of nursing students at Oak Creek Memorial. The hospital kept her on as a visiting lecturer after the scandal broke, after the general's press conference, after institutional shame became institutional change. She told them about competence that transcends titles. About integrity that threatens corruption. About the cost of hiding who you are, and the cost of hiding from who you are. The worn combat boots sat on the podium beside her, visible now, claimed now, no longer a secret. "Heroes walk among us," she said, her voice steady and clear. "Sometimes in scrubs, saving lives in the dark. Sometimes in uniform. Sometimes in both. The question isn't whether you have the skills to survive. The question is whether you have the courage to use them." The students stood and applauded, not because they knew what she was quoting, not because they fully understood the weight of what she carried, but because they recognized something true in her voice. Authority earned. Power that didn't demand respect because it didn't need to. Katie Rodriguez, Senior Chief, Reaper, Survivor, Guardian, finally stood in the light, and the light finally recognized her back. If you've ever felt invisible despite your competence, if you've ever been underestimated by people who didn't know your story, subscribe and hit that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to know that silence isn't the same as weakness. Sometimes it's just a warrior waiting for the moment to speak.